It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to look at a congressional report on the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act that came out yesterday. We're going to talk about some comments that Ronda Rousey made, that Francis Ngannou made, that Jake Paul and Nikisa Badarian made. We're going to talk about Malki Kawa's negotiations with the UFC. We're going to talk about some comments Sean O'Malley made. And we're going to ask the question, is Eddie Hearn the savior of fighters across the world? But before we get into all that, I would highly recommend that you pick up a paid subscription because as regular listeners know, we do put about half of our show behind a paywall. Now, John, how the heck are you?
Pretty good. I'm back in Los Angeles. It's 90 something today, so I'm melting. I went from the freezing tundra to the simmering heat of Southern California. So going fine, I guess.
All right. Well, I am here in lovely spring weather. It's like 71 degrees here in San Antonio. It's been super nice today. The high was 74. So I feel like I'm experiencing the California weather right now.
Well, enjoy it while you can because I'm sure it'll be blistering hot in about a week.
Yeah, I know. It'll be 99 next week, I'm sure. So, as always, we start off our shows with updates that may have happened to the UFC antitrust cases. So, John, were there any?
Yeah, there was one small filing. It's not a major filing, but there was a legal brief filed by Zuffa, the UFC's parent company, and TKO operating company that was opposing a request by the plaintiffs that they had filed previously for nearly $180,000 in attorney's fees and costs. And they're asking for that under what's a federal rule of civil procedure 37. And so that's what that $180,000 is for, is it stems from the discovery dispute they had in the antitrust class action case. People recall the UFC has not handed over a lot of discovery material. There was a whole hearing on it. The judge suggested there'd be sanctions against the UFC, asked what type of sanctions the plaintiffs want, and one of them is attorney's costs, and now they're putting in a request for attorney's costs, basically saying, because of your BS, we have been spending extra time negotiating this in the court over this, and so you have to pay us. So that's the purpose. Now, the defendant's main argument against why they have to pay these fees, besides the fact we don't want to pay fees, their first one is that the motion was premature, that the plaintiffs filed it while the parties were still negotiating, and so the defendants had already offered to supplement the response within weeks. So the fees shouldn't be awarded when a good faith meet and confer process was already underway. They also say the defendants' response were substantially justified under another rule, 33D, to cite documents is expressly permitted by the federal rules. And so reasonable people could disagree about whether it was sufficient here. Their third one was no billing records were submitted. So the plaintiffs provided only a summary table rather than actual time records. So that wasn't broken down by the cost. And finally, they claimed the fees were unreasonable. Defendants challenged the 205 hours billed as excessive for a narrow discovery dispute, and the rate up to $1,400 an hour. God, I should be an attorney at that rate, as far above the Las Vegas market rate. So that's their defense. That's really the only thing that happened. I'm sure something was filed immediately after we went on air. But up to that point, that's the only new update we have, is the plaintiffs are seeking some monetary compensation related to attorney's fees, related to the costs of the discovery process so far.
All right. Let's move on to some more legal stuff, and that is a congressional report that came out yesterday. And that congressional report was on the proposed Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act bill. What is the purpose of this report?
Well, the document that was posted is a House committee report, and this accompanies the bill itself, which is numbered H.R. 4624. Full name is the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act of 2026. So apparently they're laying the ground that there might be future ones. And so the committee reports like this, they serve several distinct purposes in the legislative process. Formally, they are it's a legislative document. Its purpose is to formally transmit the bill from the committee, where it came out of a committee on education and workforce, to the full House representatives for consideration. So these reports include the bill itself and material related to it, like the discussions in the committee, so the full House can look over it and make a judgment based on that. Obviously you can do additional investigating if you want, but it's, that's one of the intents. It also serves as a political document because the report also functions as a political statement from multiple perspectives. The majority that voted for it use it to make the case for why the bill is necessary and beneficial. And so it cites testimony, research, historical context to justify each provision. And then there's an additional views section, mostly from the Democratic members here, serves the opposite purpose in some respects. They acknowledge, improvements to be made, stuff like that. It's kind of what's a little strange here is usually, if I recall correctly, it's not additional views. It's usually, I think it's considered oppositional views when they do these type of bills. But in this case, they report it as additional views, which I guess I'm taking note of that. I don't know how important that is or not. I should say normally it's prepared as minority views addendum, and here it's just reported as additional views. In addition, it's a public information document. And so more broadly, the report serves as the primary public explanation of what the bill does and why. It provides historical background on federal boxing regulation, things like that. Later, when it progresses and there's an additional reports written, these reports serve as a source of legislative history, so you can look over the reasoning for the bill. We talked about this when we talked about why TKO would want to amend the Ali Act in the first place, why the Ali Act prevents promoters from having their own titles. You have to look through the legislative history, the reasoning behind the bill to get to that. And so that serves partly a purpose here as well. And so that's the primary purpose. Now, the author, also there's some claims in it. And one of the claims too it makes is that the bill improves on the original Ali Act. And it's worth noting that the document actually contains two distinct author perspectives. They give somewhat different accounts of the bill's improvements. So the majority committee view, committee report frames the bill as necessary for modernizing this outdated law. And it argues that the Ali Act and Professional Boxing Safety Act were enacted decades ago, so with no update since. So it claims the bill improves on existing laws in several ways, brings up the health and safety. It adds mandatory MRIs and neurological testing after, reflecting the decades of research on CTE and traumatic brain injury since then. It also increases the number of required ambulances and ringside physicians at UBO events. On the financial protections, it establishes a federal minimum pay floor, $200 per round, which the original law did not have. It also significantly raises insurance minimums, requiring $50,000 in medical coverage and adding a new $15,000 accidental death benefit. On drug testing, it incorporates World Anti-Doping Agency prohibited substance list. And on title integrity, it limits sanctioned organizations and UBOs to awarding only one championship title per weight class. And finally, I guess it introduced the concept of a UBO. And the one thing I want to note, too, the final thing on this, when I kind of summarize the bill, the final thing I want to note is that I find this really interesting, a little frustrating. It brings up several times how the original act, the importance, one of the things that it was intended for was to ban coercive contracts. A key tool in the original bill was limiting contracts to a maximum of 12 months when it was a coercive provision. And that's defined as as a requirement to get a bout. In other words, if someone offers you a fight with another fighter, if a promoter offers you a bout with one of his fighters, the only way you can fight that fighter, especially if they own a title or championship or highly rated, and they require you to give options to fight them, the maximum length of those contracts can only be 12 months. And if it's a title fight, if it's a mandatory declared by a sanction organization, there can be no options. And so it talks about that, how important that was, one of the important things that they introduced. And then we get to the new bill. And what is the new bill? The new bill carves out a separate track for UBOs, and the contract protections are gone in that new version. So that's the one thing that really caught my eye. It's like it kind of admit that this was the purpose of the original bill, and now this new, better version carves that an exception to that, so that no longer applies.
Wow. Tell me about the section called additional views. So, what are these additional views?
Well, this is the part that mostly takes in view the Democrats' additional views section, because it seems like the Democrats, for the most part, were the ones who had trouble with the bill. And they cite several times, one thing is they can't understand why they're in such a rush to pass this bill with such minimum input, such minimum investigation. I should note, though, even though coming out of committee, it was overwhelmingly voted for. But even those people that supported it seem to wonder, why does it have to be rushed through? And I think we know why it has to be rushed through, because TKO wants it rushed through. And so they wrote this other portion called additional views from those that are not fully in agreement with the document, with the bill. And one area they cite is areas for further improvement, right? And that area for further improvement, they note that first I should say on the previous portion where they talk about the bill, they did cite the parts that the Democrats did to improve the bill, the parts that they worked on to add to improve it, and I don't agree with all of them being improvements. There are some, Omar included some stuff about they were supposed to protect against coercive contract, the market power of a UBO. Namely, you have to pay a fighter a minimum if you don't get their minimum number of bouts. That they have the right to negotiate the last month of the contract, even if they haven't had their last fight yet. I have no problem really with either one of those. And then it brings up, she added that 6 month, the contract can't be more than 6 years. Well, that's I don't know, pardon my French, but that's a shit ton longer than the 12 months of the exclusive, the course of contracts, right? So I don't know how great that is. It caps it in a way that didn't exist before, but a lot of states like New York and California already have shorter durations than that. And if you read the original legislative congressional hearings, there were arguments that the contracts really should only be 3 years long. And so we are going with a 6 year in this bill. In addition, apparently some Democrats or someone is the one that added that drug testing and $50,000 medical coverage minimum, right? Which is going to kill all the club shows. So I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I don't think that was a great benefit. But to get back to what they think would be further improvements, the Democrats identified on health and safety several gaps that could be improved, such as additional testing, things like that. They also think that they could do things like raising for the minimum pay, that it should be go up with inflation. That was actually a suggestion by Andy Foster in California. So it's still noted. They also talk about they want to ensure enforceability of boxing rights, act rights by prohibiting contracts between boxers and UBOs from including clauses that bar class action proceedings, that mandate private arbitration instead of court access, that limit available remedies, or require boxers to pay a UBO attorney's fee. They note in the footnote, if you look in the footnote, that Zuffa boxing contracts already contain such clauses, and UFC, we know, have those clauses because they're being argued about in the UFC antitrust case. They also suggest that UBO boxing ratings be regulated And since that leaves it unregulated, I doubt that happens because the entire purpose of this bill is to not have regulated rankings for the UBOs. And then finally, they included a bunch of unanswered questions. And here the Democrats expressed frustration that questions submitted for the record from the committee's one and only hearing on the bill still had not been answered by the time the report was filled. And they framed this as a reason the bill should not have been rushed to the floor. And I should note that it was Mark Takano, a Republican representative, who posed pointed questions at Andy Foster. One of them, he asked whether Andy Foster had any conversations with TKO Holdings, Zuffa Boxing, Endeavor Group, or anyone associated with UFC or Zuffa Boxing about possible employment. If you remember right, Andy didn't quite answer that, I think. He also asked whether, if the answer to that was yes, Foster had disclosed those conversations to other members of the California State Athletic Commission. So those pointed questions were not fully answered. And then Representative Ilhan Omar, she submitted a much longer, more detailed set of questions to Foster covering 6 broad areas, such as she asked how the creation of UBOs would change the role and authority of state athletic commissions. She asked whether which Ali Act protections would still clearly apply to UBO fighters. I think that's pretty important. And whether any protections would be harder or impossible to enforce if major leagues operated as a UBO. And she also asked Foster to be specific about what types of entities he realistically expects to form UBOs. And so she had other questions like that. That's a bunch of her questions. And so so you get to that, apparently there are questions still being raised, questions still being asked about the UBOs, about the bill. They also brought up it was referenced and even cited one of the footnotes, the UFC antitrust litigation. In the additional views, Omar and Stevens' amendment, they can track protections where necessary. They identified the UFC's business practices as a case example of the risk that a UBO would exercise enormous control over boxers' careers. And then they even state directly that these practices have been cited in multiple lawsuits, which we have talked about endlessly, and even brought up the fact that one case was settled for $375 million. So I will post this document in the Substack. So if anybody wants to download and read it, but it kind of gives you an understanding of where we at with the bill, what they expect from the bill. And I think what it suggests is Congress really doesn't understand what the bill does. And if they do, they don't care because it's there to help TKO.
Wow. Okay. So, quick question. In your personal opinion, the current antitrust cases, which one of them would be affected most if this thing gets rushed through?
Well, I think the one that really gets potentially affected is the Phil Davis case, because his complaint directly cites the Ali Act, the legislative history. And so you'd have a new legislative history that seems to override the previous one, which maybe negates the intent of that bill. So his bill cites how the Ali Act brought up that a promoter controlling their titles, the way the UFC does, can be potentially abused as a restraint to trade.
You mean his complaint?
His complaint, sorry. Yeah. What did I say it was? His contract, probably. His complaint.
You said his bill.
Oh, his bill. I'm like, yeah, he's in Congress somewhere filing bills. His complaint, I'm sorry, it cites the Ali Act, specifically the idea of the legislative history when they discussed how the control of the title, when a promoter had control over a title, how they could gain market power, monopoly power, use it for coercing fighters to sign with them. And so he brings that up. And so this new bill, no longer was that considered a restraint to trade, because the new bill clears the way that, that's accepted practice for a promoter that acts like a UBO, which the UFC, is. And it's might be one of the reasons why a lot of these UFC practices were included in the bill, so they could cite that and say, listen, we are just following the rules of boxing. We are operating as a UBO. So these coercive contract provisions and the ability to use titles shouldn't apply to us, that it's not a restraint to trade. So I think it seems apparent to me that would be the one that potentially could be impacted the most by the passage of this bill.
In your educated opinion, would you say that the pushing through of this bill especially with all the concessions that seem to mirror what UFC does, is in fact to shut down any kind of class actions in the future?
I do not know if that's the primary purpose. I think the primary purpose is to protect their boxing entity from doing practices so they can be like the UFC without being challenged. I guess that would be the class action suits in the future, without being challenged for engaging in acts that violate the Ali Act. I think that's the primary. Now, you can't help, though, that read the bill, read the inserted provisions, read how they apply to the UFC, and wonder if a secondary intent of the bill is let's extend some sort of additional antitrust protection, almost an antitrust exemption, to not just our Zuffa boxing in the future, but to the UFC indirectly. Now, it doesn't guarantee it. You could still challenge this in court, but it would strengthen their defense, I think, if this bill passed. And you have to wonder if that was not the secondary intent, that they intentionally put in certain parts of it to make sure that you could say this bill, the nature of this bill would apply to the UFC, and thus the UFC is not engaging in restraints of trade because these are federally accepted practices.
And my final question about them, and I quote, unintentional, you said possible unintentional effect is killing club level shows. Could that effect maybe be intentional so that they control club level shows, so that they can introduce like contender series for boxing and effectively just run everyone out of business except for themselves?
It's kind of hard for me to take, I just have to take a guess, my gut feeling. I assume, just based on the fact that it's introduced by a Democrat, apparently, I assume that was not the intent, that the intent was, now, you can argue, you can make a storyline and say, yeah, there is theoretically a reason why the UFC would want to do that. If they drive club shows, the way the system is currently built, then you can't build the traditional avenues becoming a star dry up, and then they can introduce a new system to kind of, to the current system of how boxers are develop. If you dry that up, then the other promoters are starved because the pipeline that they had before no longer exists, and then we can introduce a new method. So there's an argument. I could see someone making a case why they would want that, but like I said, because a Democrat, not a Republican, a Democrat, that doesn't say the Democrats, some of them aren't working with TKO, aren't influenced by their lobbying. But it suggests to me it's more likely that they just put this in like, we want to strengthen the bill and help fighters without really understanding what it would do. But the unintended consequence of it damaging promoters, at the same time, I wonder if TKO cares at all, because it doesn't hurt them. It's like, well, whatever it takes to get the bill passed, even if you include stuff that hurt these club shows, we don't care, because what we're concerned about primarily is just how it would impact us.
Okay. Now, since we're on the topic of the Revival Act, what did you think of USA Boxing revoking their support of the bill last week?
Well, we had heard, me and you I think we'd received some messages that there were members of that were not happy with that vote, that there was not a true. It reminds me of the ABC, where the board of directors voted to endorse the bill, but the overall body of the ABC apparently is not supportive, opposed to this new bill. But the job, I guess I would view a couple of things. One is the purpose of having them claim that they supported it has already been served, because it got through committee. They could submit it with all the other endorsements and say, oh, look at all the people supporting it. Now that hurdle has been covered. That hurdle has been leapt over. And so no longer do they really need the endorsement, I think, anymore. So that's one. But two, I think it kind of shows that, I think it demonstrates that there is opposition on the grassroots level from a bunch of people, the ABC and other entities, smaller club show promoters now with the new drug testing. But their voices are pretty meek, and they have little input, and no one really cares what they have to say. And so this, the intent, the powers that be, they know how to target specific members of these groups to get endorsements from them to make it look like there's a much broader support in order to get the bill passed.
Now, there was a presser for Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano that generated some very interesting comments. Now, Ronda said that the UFC does not pay its fighters well, but she noted that I'm sorry, this makes me laugh so much. If Dana White were running the promotion, they'd be paid so much better. What did you think of that?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's just Ronda has intentionally come up with the storyline because she knows what will work up the fans more, and she doesn't want to really pick a fight with Dana White. If just like it's a strategic move, or she really believes that she believes Dana White and the Fertittas, because you hear that a lot from fighters, from fans, that Dana White and the Fertittas really cared, and it's that Endeavor are the ones, kind of like taking advantage of fighters. But I don't know if people are aware of this, but the antitrust lawsuit started when Dana White and the Fertittas, Zuffa was running the company. And I don't know if you're aware of this, the pay scale back then was almost the same as it is now, the percentage of revenue going to the fighters. In fact, in 2014, one of the years Ronda Rousey started taking off as one of their attractions, that year, the UFC in total revenue, I think, was $449 million in total revenue. So, 1/3 what they're getting now. But they also, in event revenue, I think there was $419 million, a ballpark like that. But total payout to fighters was only 15% of revenue, and in direct payouts, the purses was only 15% of the event revenue. So they're paying out only 15%. And as we've discussed, we know from 2016 to 2023, it was like 16.9% on average. It might have dipped since then, but so that was a bad year. That year was lower than the years before and lower than the years after. And guess who was in charge of the company that year? And the people running it were the Fertittas and Dana White. They're the ones that paid that little. The EBITDA that year, I think, was $70 million. Now their net income profit was $29 million, I believe. I'm going off memory here. $29 million, which is not, huge profits, but people got to remember back then that they had to pay like $250,000 or more, not $250,000, $25 million, $26 million per year in interest on the loans they took out to pay themselves hundreds of millions of dollars. So there was scores of millions available to pay the fighters more if they wanted to, without putting the company in the hole. They also, back then, they had just excessive jet fees because they were flying everywhere in their private jet, well beyond what a company would normally. So that's more money apparently could have been applied to fighters. So that was back then. And I should know too, Ronda Rousey was the highest paid fighter that year in 2014. Highest paid fighter in 2 fights. She made a whole $1.8 million. So that's who she says were the people that really cared about and would taking care of the fighters and would pay them. I beg to differ. I think the reason the company's worth so much, the reason their profit levels are so high, the reason Endeavor bought them in the first place is because Dana White and especially the Fertittas set up a business where they didn't have to pay the fighters much. And this is just a continuation of the business they set up that allowed them to sell it for $4 billion.
Francis Ngannou, he discussed legacy at the press conference, and he said that legacy does not pay the bills and that it was a construct for the UFC to keep fighter pay down. In your opinion, does legacy matter at all?
Well, I mean, for some fighters, I'm sure, the truth is it's prize fighting, right? And so you kind of assume fighters, this is their profession. In a perfect world, you'd want legacy and financial success to go hand in hand. And in some ways, the sport should be designed. That was the intent behind some regulations. They wanted that to happen because title fights generally pay more. Having the championship makes you more valuable. And so if you could somehow have freedom while you had the title, and so that you were not restricted under a contract that paid you less, that would be the best of both worlds, but we don't live in that world in MMA. So for Francis, I mean, he is a prize fighter. He is looking to gain the prize. If legacy is what's going to tie you down, if legacy is going to keep you from being paid as much or having freedom, then I think it makes perfect sense for him not to go for legacy. And that it's true that that is how coercive contracts work under the definition in the Ali Act. If I am a promoter and you want to go for legacy of winning the MMA title of whatever promotion, either the UFC or PFL, well, let's be honest, the one only cares about now is the UFC. Maybe back in the day, Pride, or a little bit Strikeforce, but UFC is the title. If you want to be the UFC champion, I can say, well, if you want to fight for the championship, you have to sign with us, and you have to sign with us in a contract we agree to. That's on our terms, not yours. The same with, if you want a title shot, you have to take a new contract that we agree to on our terms. And that's a coercive contract. You are dictating that you can only fight for the title if you come to you sign a special contract with us, an extension or one that pays that's on terms, I should say, to the promoter's benefit. That's what the coercive contract, the prohibition on coercive contracts was supposed to prevent in the Ali Act in boxing. And that's the main reason why boxers make so much more is because when they get those title fights, when they get to that level, they do not have to cave in on negotiations. And so here France is right, because legacy, the idea of getting these titles, these championship, building up your record, your legacy for your career, it comes with the strings attached that you have to cave in order to get that. And so, if you're looking for if you're focused on the prize fighting part, which, as professionals, you kind of assume they are, then you have to make the tough decision of foregoing legacy. And I think that's what he's arguing for, and that's what he's done.
Now, you said that let's be real. The only MMA promotion that matters is the UFC. Is there a world that you see MVP giving them a little competition, considering the momentum that they've managed to build for themselves with boxing, and now they're putting on their first MMA show?
The short answer is no. Let me elaborate on that. I guess you could say they have a potential to serve as some competition because they are putting on these spectacles. But these type of cards, these spectacle cards, there's a limited number you can do. It's the full roster. They're not going to be competing for the full roster of the UFC. They're going to be competing for select few fighters, the biggest name fighters, often the older fighters that might have something left in them. So the competition would be with regards to fighters. Let's say, I think an obvious one is Conor McGregor. 2 fights left. Jon Jones, if he could somehow get out of his contract. Potentially Tom Aspinall. Fights that there are pre-existing fights for them to compete in, that they are the biggest draws in the UFC, because what they're going to be putting on are these, again, spectacles. They might do 1, 2, 3, 4 per year. France is a good example here as well. France is originally supposed to be signed to fight Rico Verhoeven. This was a last minute fill, so they're probably planning on using him on a different fight in the future. To note also, that suggests to me that his pay is probably higher than what I originally suspected, because if he was being signed to fight Rico Verhoeven, that I would assume that he's getting something similar, at least to his PFL deal, because that'd be considered a pretty big fight, and that they're throwing in this replacement fight just to keep them on the card so they can build them up to a future one. And so, yeah, that's the type of competition they're going to provide the UFC, which is not true competition, because it's just a handful of select fighters they're going to be competing for. What you want is a promotion that is doing kind of what the UFC is doing with basically they're trying to put on the top fighters as a ranking, the number one fighter in the world, that they want the public to view that. And so in that case, you would need somehow to have either the fighters in MVP to be viewed as truly the best fighters in the world, in some ways, a pride to the UFC's UFC, a pride promotion to the UFC, and or that UFC fighters that are highly ranked could leave the UFC. That's the only way you'd get kind of true competition, because in that case, you'd be competing not just for, Ronda versus Congressional 10 years after they stop fighting, this one time, the future. There's not a lot of fights left in the bag for those two, I don't think. Instead, you'd be competing for what fighter can we build up? What young prospects can we go for? What journeyman can we use to build up our prospects? In other words, how can we build a whole environment to establish new top fighters and put them in where they can compete and beat the other top fighters? They can claim they are the best. As I guess the simplest way to put it, where Carlos Newton used to say, that would be a situation where instead of fighters are competing for promoters, so they would let them fight for titles, the current situation, instead you'd have a situation where the promoters, the fighters are competing for titles, for rankings, for championships, and the promoters are competing for the fighters that can win those championships. And that we are a long, long way from that being the possibility right now. In fact, it's an impossibility right now because the UFC has all the top fighters locked down.
Okay. Now, both Jake Paul and Francis Ngannou brought up Jon Jones asking for his release. As a matter of fact, everybody's been talking about it, even Eddie Hearn. But to get back to my point, Jake Paul suggested that he come over to get paid what he's worth. Come over to MVP and get paid what you're worth. And Ngannou tweeting that the UFC should be rolling out the red carpet for him. Is there any chance Jones could be released or get out of his contract?
Well, released, I find extremely unlikely. The UFC doesn't really do that. They've never done that. Now, could he get out of his contract? But I mean, there's a few hypothetical ways that he could challenge it. I should note we've had Rob Macy on it. I've seen Rob Macy or the MMAFA on Twitter basically begging people like Jon Jones to contact him. I think we asked Rob Macy on the show once, do you have a plan to potentially get fighters out of their contract? Do you have a way to challenge it? And he, I think he said, or at least he did not say no. He highly suggested that they have a theory about how to do that. And it seems like he's always on social media, basically begging. I don't think he's begging all fighters. I think you have to be a specific type of fighter. That's my guess, that the higher, the bigger name fighters are more likely the ones that he could do this for. But he's basically begging people like Jon Jones and other fighters that are disgruntled to contact him, and no one does. And so Jon Jones, we were in this situation before several years ago when he was upset that he wasn't getting Deontay Wilder money and he wanted his release. UFC didn't release him, and Jon Jones had what seems likely that he had an avenue to get out of his contract. He could done what Francis Ngannou did. It seems very likely that Jon Jones also had a sunset provision in his contract back then. But he decided not to take advantage of it. Instead of that, to sign an 8-fight contract so that he could fight Gane and then Miocic and then start complaining again. And so I think this, the track record of Jon Jones is someone that is not going to challenge the UFC contract. He will complain, ask for release, but he will not take the gamble, the risk to actually challenge the contract. And that's not to say it's a guarantee, but there are, if he really was serious, there are avenues to potentially challenge it, I believe. I mean, there's always the talk you could go into boxing and get the Ali boxing license to challenge on the Ali Act front. That kind of only works if there's interest in watching you box. I don't know how much interest there is in watching Jon Jones box, but so that might preclude that possibility. But they had a new contract change. We'd have to read his specific details of his contract, and we'd have to look at what communications there were between the promotion and Jon Jones and his management over the contract. But it seems very possible with the change when they're now going to Paramount, where there's no pay-per-views. It seems very possible that you could challenge it, that he lost the benefit of the bargain because he lost pay-per-views without any input on his side. So his contract, which was expecting pay-per-view bonuses, is now should be void because the material nature of the contract no longer applies. So that's another possibility. There's potentially many others, all depending on what his contract actually says, and how big a gamble you're willing to take. But Jon Jones, again, from history, seems not to be the type of person that wants to challenge these contracts. This is, we see in boxing, we see boxers repeatedly challenge their contracts against the promoter. But in MMA, specifically the UFC, it's much, much less likely that we see that. And I think this is, that's for that reason. I think it's very unlikely we see Jon Jones leave the UFC.
And that specific type of fighter that Rob Macy would be targeting is probably the ones that were at the level they would get pay-per-view points, correct?
I mean,
that seems like the most logical route anyways.
Well, I think there's certain here's a couple things. One is I do know, based on talking to some fighters, that either Rob Mason, the MMAFA, or someone involved got them out of their contracts with other promoters, maybe in the UFC once in the past, I can't remember, but other promotions, one specifically. And, you know, it was basically what happens in boxing is they challenge something in the contract, said, you guys are in violation, release me. And that fighter was released. So it's happened in that situation. Maybe that it had happened here. If they would just basically tell the UFC that your contract is void for these reasons. Do you really want to challenge us? And the UFC would say, no, we know we're in violation. It's not worth challenging. We will quietly release you to not make a big deal and pretend we were the ones that made this decision. That's a possibility. But for the most part, I think you're right that it's the higher up fighters, well, I guess to get a release for the lower end, sometimes easier if it's a clear violation. But for the higher fighter, it's usually got to be a bigger name fighter because the financial incentive got to be high enough to make it worth the risk, right? If you're, it's only worthwhile to take a risk, a potential legal risk, go to court, spend money, maybe be tied up if there's the potential of big payday at the end. And so that's why the top fighters are the ones the most likely to want to take that route. Also, I think just guessing, but I think based on the Davis lawsuit, I think there's potentially a lot more arguments that you could make involving the course of contract nature of MMA, the restraint of trade, that you can cite your ranking and your spot in the sport if you wanted to be creative. So I think there's that possibility as well. But usually it's just that there's only a benefit when there's such a big payday. Like everybody brought up after Conor McGregor threatened to get his boxing license and use the Ali Act. Well, why doesn't every other fighter?
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!